Very good morning to all of you. Apologies for this delay in starting the morning session, but it was mostly to help local participants to come in. We know how the city traffic is. But nevertheless, we look forward to the day. We had a very interesting day yesterday. The first session today is on financing digital and next generation infrastructure, the role of public and private sectors. We have a very distinguished chair for this session with us. He has been there yesterday and has been leading us throughout. Dr. Partha Mukhopadhyay, who is Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research. The eminent panelists include Mr. Parag Kaur, who would join us from the Qualcomm. He is Vice President, Government Affairs, Qualcomm. He would join over Skype from Delhi. Professor V. Sridhar, noted expert and from the International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore. Dr. Lalit Chugh, advisor and PPP expert, Infrastructure Development Department, Government of Karnataka. Mr. Saugat Biswas, who is Transport Commissioner as well as Secretary IT, Government of Jammu and Kashmir. He is with us today. Mr. Rajendra Mishra, hopefully is also here. Commissioner Income Tax, Central Processing Center, Bengaluru, and Ms. Nandini Chami, Deputy Director, IT for Change, Bengaluru. So may I request our panelists to join the dais, please. A small housekeeping announcement. Probably we will, have to cover up for the tea break that we have in between, but we'll have the tea served inside the hall.
So I believe the first presentation, as Sabishasi said, is going to be on Skype. So are we setting that up? Yeah. All of you have the profiles of the speakers in your conference packages. So I'm not going to sort of spend time doing that. And therefore, yes, welcome, Parag, and you're very visible and very, so please, you have about, let us say, the way we will organize this is about 7 minutes for initial remarks, and then if you have, and then hopefully we'll open up a discussion going forward. So, Parag, the floor is yours.
Providing communication services, and there was a huge wait list, right, of telecommunication services which the public basically was requesting, and they were not able to fulfill that requirement. So with the entry of private sector, we actually have seen a huge growth in telecom services in India, with the wait list vanished, and a person is actually holding multiple phones, right? But in spite of all these that we have seen, there have been some kind of gaps which still remain. And the gap is that most of the rural areas, where we see the India's population resides, we have not been able to take mobile coverage, especially the data coverages, right? And there, the problem that we find, where more investment is required and more amount of work is required to be done. And if you see today, if I want to draw your conclusion, draw your attention on the amount of money that has been spent. See, the total amount of investment that has happened till date, if you quantify it, you'll find that it is roughly around 8 lakh crores. And this 8 lakh crores is a huge amount of money, right? It's more than $100 billion, which is roughly around 120, $25 billion, right? And this is where the financing aspect comes in, because when such huge investments are at stake, you need to find ways to finance it. And more optimal the investment is, more easy it becomes to finance, because the finance, when you are financing investments such as this, you need to basically take care of return on investment, right? But the basic problem that we see in India is that out of this 8 lakh crores of investment which has been made on digital infrastructure, 50% is actually being spent on acquiring spectrum. And that is going to be a big distortion and basically a big problem that we have to encounter in our country. Because such amount of money spent on spectrum, which is roughly around to the tune of 4 lakh crores, is going back to the exchequer, right? Without having contributing to a significant amount of asset building exercise, right? The asset building exercise is the most important work that we need to do, because in order to take coverage to the remotest part of the country, we have to create BTS, we have to put equipment, we have to energize those spectrum that we have acquired. So those activities are going in the sideline, and the money is basically being spent on spectrum. The story does not end here, because the quantum of spectrum that we have acquired, or the operators have acquired, on a pan-India basis, if you quantify it, you will find that it is roughly around 100 plus megahertz. And the focus now is to enhance data connectivity, to go to the next generation technologies like 5G, etc. Which means that if you quantify the amount of spectrum that is going to be required in your future, you will find that it is roughly going to be around 50 times than what we have today, because the 5G band, which is basically 6 plus gigahertz to 28 gigahertz, needs around 5,000 megahertz of spectrum, right, in order to fulfill our requirement of 5G and other kind of activities that we are planning to visualize going forward. And there, we need to do something in order to minimize the cost of spectrum, because the current rates are not going to be sustainable. The other thing that is very important for us to realize is that in order to leverage the wireless network's capability, there has to be a very strong wireline network, right, which should supplement and aggregate the traffic emanating out of these base stations and carry them to the switching centers. And we are lacking there as well, because the optical fiber backbone networks, right, aren't really, there still, which can leverage the goal that we have to connect the rural areas and other parts of the country. So we need to spend a lot of money on optical fiber network as well. Fortunately, the government of India has done a lot of work in taking optical fiber connectivity to the rural areas, right, especially the BharatNet program, and which can be of great help, because if there is a focus of taking bandwidth, right, which to areas where the viability gap is huge, then at least that piece of the investment is taken care of. And then what we need is to further disseminate this using the wireless network. So I think that we are kind of heading in the right direction, but there are certain amount of policy changes which are required to be made in order to remove this unnecessary spending on assets which are not really being utilized. And we need to optimize that investment in order to spend more money on creating towers, energizing those spectrum that we have acquired, putting money on equipment, and creating digital optical fiber networks, right? And that is where the focus should be. And I think the private sectors, which have been pivotal in our digital, in digitizing India's journey starting from 1999, if their health can be preserved, and if they can be motivated to make this investment by guaranteeing return on investment, I think India's digital India story can become much more, visible and achievable. Thank you.
Thank you, Parag. As Parag has been printed, that there is a way of thinking about how we use these kinds of assets for, in some sense, revenue generation of the public sector. And then how do we then end up looking at that's what we've been doing so, but the assets have therefore not been leveraged to provide the most effective use of these assets in terms of expanding reach and access. And sort of he builds upon, as Rajat was saying yesterday, the need to ensure that you do have initiatives like BharatNet, etc., roll out really rapidly and really effectively if you want to fully leverage the digital infrastructure at this place. So let's take that thought and then turn to Professor Sridhar. I believe you have a presentation. So could we have that on, please? And Parag, can you hear us? Will Parag be with us through the session? Yeah.
Okay, so this is just one slider to sort of indicate, where are we investing with respect to digital India. So if you look at the, bottom, there is the infrastructure layer, and the one above that is the platform, the other, the top is services. And I have color-coded it so that we can clearly distinguish between what is built by the government through government financing, which is red, and green, which is basically a public-private partnership in the sense that there is some investment by the public sector units of the government and also some by the private sector companies. So if you look at the bottom layer, which is the infrastructure layer, most of it, there is 3 green and 3 red, so equally populated with 1 blue, which is purely private sector funded. Now, if you look at the infrastructure layer, BharatNet, we have spent quite an amount of government money, mainly from the Universal Service Obligation Fund, in order to build the infrastructure, the optic fiber backbone, national backbone, up to the panchayat level. But if you look at the access, for example, Parag mentioned about access, to the network. That is mostly by the private sector. Of course, there is the public sector units such as BSNL, MTNL who have put in some infrastructure, but mainly it is by the private sector. The other infrastructure including, for example, cable, DTH, these are all purely by private players. There is some amount of notion in the NTP 2018 draft of which has been released recently, that government might spend on public Wi-Fi infrastructure, but there is no specific mention about whether it will be funded or not, but there is a mention about public Wi-Fi infrastructure, which has to grow up to about 500,000 public Wi-Fi hotspots in the country, which will provide access to the internet. We also have, recently launched the navigation through Indian constellation, which will provide the GPS capabilities through the Indian navigation, satellite system. So that is a very major breakthrough that we have done to Department of Space, which is highlighted here in red, because that will also be that's also through government funding. Now, if you go above to the platform
Sridhar,
layer,
I'm not sure how well it's sort of visible at the back.
Yeah.
So if you can just quickly, as you move through, as you're giving these examples, if you could just quickly point out.
Do you have a laser pointer?
So, but that's, if you could just tell, the first 3 green bands, what kind of issues.
Even I am not able to see. So,
okay. Or just the big one
right.
that you have this.
So the infrastructure layer, starting from left, that is, the access, telecom access services, which is mostly by private companies, but also BSNL and MTNL are involved. The next one is public internet. The most of it is through the government, and then you have public Wi-Fi. Part of we are not sure whether government is going to fund it or not, so that's why I have put it in green. The next one is the Indian satellite navigation system, GPS, which has been launched with the Department of Space. The next one is the INSAT satellite systems, through which we get services such as, for example, DTH and so on. Then cable TV and DTH purely by private sector. We are not sure about cyber infrastructure because it's still in the gray, because we have not decided as to who will fund it and who will do it. And then the big one is BharatNet. Above that is the platform layer level. In the platform, if you see, we have created a government cloud which provides cloud services for, basically by government. And then you have private cloud, which is owned by private companies. And then you have Aadhaar for biometric authentication, which has been purely done by through government investment. Then you have the payment systems, which has been created by the National Payment Corporation of India for payment, digital finance and digital payment infrastructure. And then we have the open government data sources through which any kind of services can be provided. And I am viewing all these as platforms above which the services can be provided. And the services is the topmost layer. So in the topmost layer, we have government G2C, G2B, and G2, for example, G services, which are provided by the government and solely by the government. That is in the middle. Then you have left and right, you have private services, and then the non-government app economy services, which has been provided by almost all the private companies. So that's how I've categorized them. And we can see that there are quite a bit of red, but there can be more red. I mean, that's what I'm saying, especially at the infrastructure and the platform layer level. So we can leave the services to the marketplace so that it can be a combination of the government as well as the private sector. So in my view, I mean, for example, most of the investment, especially in the infrastructure, has come from Universal Service Obligation Fund, which is about 60,000 crores. I mean, it is not in the 8 lakh crore ballpark that Parag has mentioned. I mean, if you look at the revenue from spectrum is 4 lakh crore, as Parag has pointed out, but it has all gone into the Central Consolidated Fund of India, and we have not really repurposed that for building the digital India infrastructure. So we have just used the 5% universal service levy, which has been provided by the private companies as part of their universal service obligation fund for use of, for example, the construction of the BharatNet. So there is still more things which can be done through revenues which are solely earned by telecom and telecom operators for building the digital India infrastructure. That's my viewpoint. So we can take questions later.
Thank you.
Sorry for the ambiguous.
That's fine.
It's not very clear.
I think that you helped quite a bit in clearing that up. Mr. Biswas, a lot of the previous discussion has largely been about providing services on the ground, and one of the areas where, of course, I'll ask you to comment on two kinds of things. One, in addition to whatever you would like to think, one is the whole issue of the role of government and private, which has come up, and the extent to which you see this, how you see the problem going forward. And secondly, the manner in which these kinds of infrastructure is being used within your sector, because that is one sector which can benefit significantly from the use of digital assets. So if you can take that away, sure. Yeah, please.
Good morning, everybody. Extremely eminent panelists and galaxy of eminent guests. All the while I came yesterday afternoon, I attended 2 sessions. I found myself as an exception here in this gathering because largely most of you are talking from the top at the policy level, at the bigger level, I may call it a cloud. I work on the ground as an executive, and our teams work on the ground. I somehow see that there is a disconnect, and when I was reading the approach paper for this conference, I saw that you also want to know or are concerned about the enabling environment of all infrastructure, financing. So I believe, as much as in my experience goes, and largely most of it are personal views, personal opinion, that I see a lack of master plan. I see a lack of master plan in the states. The center may be having a master plan, but in largely every department, when we go for implementation of plans, implementation of all this, big mission mode projects, etc., the lack of understanding at the ground level or the state policy level or creation of a roadmap, almost there is none. So the bureaucracy, whichever service may it come from, they are at a loss most of the times. It is largely individual motivation, largely individual push, largely direct relation with the government of India, direct mandate of the mission mode projects, the fundings, etc. So I believe a master plan, a roadmap needs to be set up, and the financing agencies, the finance ministry, or the originators of the mission mode projects must always ask for a master plan and a roadmap, or maybe help in creating a roadmap. Most of the times, I am sure the Indian policymakers here would know that the political executive at the state level largely are not tuned with a roadmap. So the capacity building or capacity, there's a huge gap in capacity building and understanding why we are doing what we are doing. Because it's a democracy, the popular will always, be more important. Votes will always be more important. But all that you are trying to do, all that you are trying to say, all that we all are trying to do needs to be appreciated by the political executive with the same energy, with the same dedication as the top level. Now, there are certain issues in the government that needs to be set right. I don't know why the government of India, the states, even after Supreme Court directives, etc., things are not happening. What I fail to understand is when we finance projects, how will the finance perform at the ground level if you don't have ownership of the plan? And how do you create ownerships? Look at the government organizations. At the top level, you make an IAS officer or some top service officer sit with all his acumen, motivation, energy, things like that. But at the bottom, you have a huge base of the pyramid, which is almost zero with capacity, almost zero with understanding of your plans, understanding of the goals. So I would request the policymakers to think about how to build up organizations in the government to hold and to execute these big policies. And that is why we can name, I can name one after the other what we have failed at doing, or what we have not been able to do with the speed that we are mandated to. One big aspect, one big reason for failure of policies, for failure of master plans, if they at all exist, is the lack of security of tenure of an officer. Largely in the government, when we go for executions, it is the top level that drives it, and every 6 to 9 months in the government, the officer is shifted. We compare the government with the private setup. I would request you to ponder. Let us take examples of big private companies, maybe middle rung private companies. How many times have you seen the CEO change, and how many years do you see the CEO change of a company? And how many times do you see the CEOs of the government agencies, government companies change? So if you make a comparison, you will understand the importance of the security tenure of an executive. Then certainly again, the selection of leaders in the government setup. The selection of leaders in the government setup is also wrought with conventional processes, which also needs to be changed, which also needs a mandate from this, maybe the central government for a change. We are not selected by a process of merit or interview. We are just selected with the, maybe the political will of the political executive because of their own whims and fancies or political reasons. So these are areas that I'm just flagging. The rest of the things are being discussed by the other eminent people. Another thing about financing, I'm working as the IT secretary, so this is something that is coming to my mind every now and then. We are creating infrastructure, say the state data center in our state, various other enabling services, various other delivery platforms. Certainly, but my problem is that after the Government of India funding ends, after the project period ends, where do I finance it from? The state budget. The state budget is always meager. So how do we sustain infrastructure that we create? At the same time, while we are creating huge infrastructure, we know that we are automating, but we are not making a corresponding reduction in manpower. So the salary bills are still huge for the government. So when I have to fund my state data center, I have to run helter-skelter to look for a DCO. So these are things which, again, we need to think of and maybe devise a roadmap how to sustain